part of the territory it conquered starting on August 6th in a surprise operation that it claims took more than 1,200. Touching on the topic of territorial concessions. Ukraine will never give up its territories because this would be an attack on the constitution, he said. Decisions on Ukrainian territorial integrity cannot be made by the president, but by the Ukrainian people. Zelensky's peace plan, backed by the West, calls for Russia to pull all of its troops out of Ukraine as a precondition for any talks. It also wants trials for war crimes and reparation payments. For its part, Russia demands that Ukraine surrender 4 regions that Moscow says it annexed and claims as Russian territory. And Ukraine would have to officially renounce its desire to join NATO. An impasse. So, could Ukraine's incursion be a way to change the calculus of peace? Although seizing Russian territory in the Kursk region is an embarrassment to Putin, still, it's less than 0.1% of Russia's landmass, whereas Russia controls about 20% of Ukraine's territory and is still advancing in the east. In addition to the land it's taken, however, Ukraine has also captured hundreds of young conscript soldiers. Zelensky refers to Russian prisoners as Ukraine's exchange fund. And Zelensky spoke specifically of the November peace summit and Ukraine's plans.
Is the Kursk operation connected to the second summit? Yes, because it is one of the points of the plan of victory of Ukraine.
Meanwhile, the Kremlin has been playing down the incursion, saying it has failed to stop Russia's drive to break through in eastern Ukraine.
People, especially in the Kursk region, are going through difficult times. But the main task that the enemy set for themselves, to stop our offensive in the Donbass, they didn't achieve it. Therefore, I'm sure that this provocation will fail. I think after that, there will be a desire really to move to peace talks, not in words, but in actions, and resolve these issues by peaceful means.
It's not clear if Kyiv's gamble to take Russian territory will pay off in peace talks this fall, or provoke Putin to take even more severe measures as he tries to win the war.
Over to DW's Nick Connolly now, who joins us from Kyiv. Nick, could Ukraine's incursion into the Russian region of Kursk shift the dynamic of the war in a way and lead the way towards peace talks?
I think, and only the most optimistic people here in Kyiv would believe that the sight of Ukrainian troops on Russian soil would immediately change everything for Russian civilians, and get them to put pressure on Putin to end this war. But this is part of a bigger kind of campaign by Ukraine to try and increase the price, the domestic price of this war for Vladimir Putin, for the Russian regime. It's not just about taking territory in Kursk. We've also seen those attacks on Russian oil refineries deep behind the front lines, behind the border with drones. We've seen attacks on other infrastructure, power infrastructure in Russia, coming off the back of Russian attacks on Ukrainian power infrastructure, basically to show the Russian population that this is not just a one-way street, that the violence that Russia is meting out to Ukraine will come back. So that is the kind of bigger picture. There's also a hope that creating this conflict on Russian soil in Kursk region will force the Russian army to move resources away from the front lines in Ukraine. We have seen first evidence of that, albeit not so much from Donbass, where the most intense fighting is, but there are reports of Russian troops being pulled back from Zaporizhia and Kharkiv regions of Ukraine to Kursk to fight the Ukrainian army there. And it's also about prisoners of war. We've had reports from the Ukrainian army of hundreds, if not thousands, of Russians and largely young conscripts being taken prisoner there that can then be exchanged for Ukrainians who've been in Russian POW captivity in for some parts, of up to 2 years. So there are lots of reasons why they seem to think this is a good idea. And for now, you get the sense from the Ukrainian leadership that they think this is a good investment of their time and their resources.
You mentioned Donbass, Nick. I mean, we're hearing that Russian troops are making significant gains in Ukraine's Donbass region. So why wouldn't Ukraine's army, focus more of its efforts there to stop that from happening?
So the short answer that you hear from Ukrainian soldiers and strategists is basically we couldn't achieve much of a difference in Donbass with the resources, with the manpower and the equipment that we've sent to Kursk. We can't check this, but they say that they have not lost much in the way of soldiers in terms of wounded and dead in Kursk, and that basically because the border was so lightly defended by the Russian side, they've been able to go deep into Russia with comparatively small numbers of people, whereas in Donbass, where the fighting has been intense basically for 10 years, it is very hard to push the Russians back. They have many better equipped and better experienced units operating there. So that's kind of their first response to all this. And they say, yes, we will go and we will send more people into Donbass. But obviously their hope is that this embarrasses Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership into pulling troops away from the front lines in Ukraine, and that then the task in the east becomes easier. They'll say something to you, they'll say, we've tried that. We tried that last summer during the counteroffensive, and sending more troops into the same positions and hope that the result will be different is just as risky, if not more, than sending people to Kursk.
Nick, as always, thank you so much for that. That's Nick Connolly reporting from Kyiv. We're joined now by Nikolai Petrov. He holds a PhD in geography from Moscow State University and is an independent researcher focused on Russian domestic politics. Thank you for your time today. I know that you've been writing about Putin's regime and whether it's close or not to crumbling for a long time. After nearly a month of having Ukrainian troops on Russian soil, is Vladimir Putin showing any signs of stress at all?
No, so far we do not see these signs, and I think that his initial reaction used to be furious, but his calculation is that waiting time and, trying to increase pressure in Donbass, he can win against Ukraine, and then Kursk region will come next.
Mm-hmm. There are some analysts who say the Kursk incursion is actually helping Putin shore up support for his war in Ukraine among Russians at home. What do you think about that?
I think, first of all, that Ukrainian army did get huge positive psychological, political result just by taking control over part of Russian territory at the beginning of this incursion. And now the game is much more risky for Ukraine because situation in Donbass is developing in a negative way for Ukraine. But in terms of Russian perception, I would say that the Kremlin keeps very low profile of what's going on in Kursk region, but it's understandable that those who are directly involved with these inhabitants of regions adjacent to Ukraine, they do see now the war as a kind of domestic one, as a kind of patriotic war, and their consolidation against what they see as their enemy did increase. And sociological polls do show that support of authorities and, first of all, support of continuing war efforts made by Russia in Ukraine is increasing.
So Putin is enjoying support at home. How can pressure be applied more effectively on him? Is it having Ukrainian troops on Russian soil, or is it Ukrainian airstrikes on Russian oil refineries, for example, or could it simply be Ukraine defending the Donbass?
First of all, I'd like to emphasize that Putin is limited in time as well. So it was more or less easy for the Kremlin to keep low profile of what's going on in Kursk region during the summer. Now situation is changing and it cannot last forever. The problem is whether Russia or Ukraine can wait for longer. But in terms of the war in general, it's understandable that any effective actions of any side, they do bring certain positive in perception of this particular side and certain negative effect. Ukrainian attacks against Russian oil refineries, they do give positive effect in terms of cutting off certain share of production, but they do create understandable negative reaction among Russians who do see that Putin was perhaps right when starting the war. He was saying that Ukraine and the West in general, they do conspire against Russia.
Ukraine says it will only negotiate a peace treaty if Russian troops leave Ukrainian soil, respect boundaries as drawn up in 2014. Can you realistically see a world where Vladimir Putin oversees a withdrawal of Russian troops from Crimea and the Donbass?
No, absolutely, it's impossible. The situation is changing, and if at the very beginning of the war, during negotiations in Istanbul, position of Russian side was more moderate, and they could speak about taking their troops out from occupied regions of Ukraine. Now it's absolutely impossible, but we should not look at what both sides are saying as at real position for negotiations. This is part of the information war, and that's why we do not see any kind of overlapping of the Kremlin's position with Ukrainian position, but the situation can change essentially in a short while after the end of what's going on now.
Nikolai Petrov, thank you so much for your thoughts and your analysis. Thanks so much for joining us on DW News.
My pleasure.